The December snow fell in whispers across the Arizona territory, each flake a silent confession settling onto frozen ground. Eleanor Blackwell knelt before two stones in the earth, her breath forming pale clouds that dissolved into the gray morning. Her hands, weathered and steady, despite the cold, reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a single brass bullet. The metal caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky as she placed it carefully atop the granite marker that bore her husband's name. Captain James Blackwell, born 1846, died December 1882. Beloved husband. The stone offered no other words, no mention of honor or service, no scripture or sentiment. Just facts, cold and immutable as the marker itself. Eleanor's lips moved without sound, forming words she had spoken every week for 3 years. The ritual never changed. She would kneel, she would place the bullet, she would speak to the silence, and the silence would answer with its own terrible weight. "I'm still here, James," she whispered, her voice barely carrying beyond her own ears. "I'm still keeping your secret." The wind moved through the pines that surrounded this small clearing, carrying with it the scent of snow and something older, something that tasted of earth and endings. Eleanor's eyes, once bright with the enthusiasm of a schoolteacher who believed in the goodness of young minds, now held only the flat gray of winter sky. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had closed on a truth too heavy to carry, yet impossible to set down. She remained kneeling long after the cold had seeped through her skirt, long after sensation left her knees. There was a penance in the discomfort, a small payment on a debt she knew could never be fully settled. 3 years ago, on a night when the wind howled like the souls of the damned, Eleanor had come home to find her husband slumped in his chair before the fire. The gun had fallen from his hand. The letter lay across his lap, corners already curling from the heat of flames that cast dancing shadows across words written in his own hand. She had stood in the doorway, snow melting from her shawl, the basket of supplies from town forgotten on the porch behind her. The memory came now as it always did, unbidden and perfect in its clarity. She could still smell the cordite, still see the way the firelight caught in the spreading darkness on his chest. Still feel the way time itself seemed to stop suspended in that moment between before and after. She had crossed the room, had taken the letter with hands that did not shake, though perhaps they should have. The first lines, blurred through tears she had not realized were falling. "My dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this, I will have found the courage that failed me in life. Forgive me for Copper Creek. Forgive me for what I did to those people. Forgive me for leaving you to carry this alone." She had read no further. The letter had curled in her hands as she fed it to the flames, watching as her husband's confession turned to ash and rose up the chimney to dissipate into the night. Some truths she had believed then were too terrible to survive their telling. Now, kneeling in the snow 3 years later, Eleanor wondered if she had made the right choice. The bullet she placed each week was one of 7 she had found in James's revolver that night. 6 had been loaded. 1 had found its mark. The others, she saved each one a small monument to the question she had refused to let him answer. What was Copper Creek? What had happened there? What had driven a man she loved, a man she had believed in, to choose death over living with his memories? The questions circled like carrion birds, patient and persistent. Eleanor rose slowly, her joints protesting the movement. She was 38 years old, but felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with years. The cabin waited beyond the tree-lined smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray column. Home, prison, sanctuary. The words meant nothing and everything. She had chosen this isolation deliberately. After James died, she could have returned to Boston to the teaching position she had abandoned when love and adventure called her west. She could have sought comfort in the familiar rhythms of civilized life. Instead, she had remained in this high valley where the snow fell deep and the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away by rough trail, Deadfall Ridge. Even the name suggested endings. The land beneath her feet held secrets beyond the one buried in the small graveyard. James had claimed this homestead for its isolation, but Eleanor had discovered the copper deposits in their second year. Veins of ore rich enough to make a fortune ran deep beneath the cabin, beneath the meadow where she kept her small garden in summer, beneath the very ground where James now rested. She had never touched it, never hired surveyors or filed the claims that would transform mineral rights into wealth. The copper could stay buried. Some things once brought to light could never be hidden again. Eleanor made her way back through the trees, following the path worn by 3 years of weekly pilgrimages. The cabin emerged from the pines solid and well-built, its logs chinked tight against the winter wind. James had constructed it with the same meticulous care he brought to everything he touched. Every corner square, every joint fitted perfectly. A home built to last. Only as she approached did the true nature of the homestead reveal itself to the careful observer. The stones lining the path were not merely decorative. Each one marked a trigger point in the elaborate system James had installed in his final year. Pressure plates buried beneath innocent-looking earth. Tripwires concealed in shadow. Deadfalls positioned to contain rather than kill, but contain with absolute certainty. Eleanor had not built these defenses. She lacked the engineering skill, the military training that such systems required. But she had learned to maintain them, guided by the detailed diagrams James had left in his journal. The same journal that contained entries she could not bring herself to read, pages that might explain Copper Creek and the darkness that had consumed him. She paused at the porch steps, noting the slight irregularity in their spacing, another of James's modifications. Anyone approaching quickly would find themselves stumbling, their attention drawn downward at the moment when vigilance should be highest. It was the work of a man who understood tactical defense at an instinctive level. What had her schoolteacher husband been before she met him? What skills had he possessed that allowed him to transform a simple homestead into a fortress? She had known he served in the army before their marriage, had seen the scars that marked his body, had held him through nightmares he could never quite explain. But she had believed those days were behind him. She had believed in the gentle man who read poetry by firelight and helped her grade papers from the small school she once taught. The man who had designed these defenses was someone else, someone she was only beginning to understand. Inside the cabin held the warmth of a well-tended fire and the silence of rooms occupied by only one. Eleanor removed her shawl and hung it by the door, a habit from years of teaching when organization and routine had provided structure to days filled with young minds and endless questions. Now the habits remained, but the purpose had drained away, leaving only the hollow comfort of familiar motions. She moved to the stove and checked the coffee still warm from the morning. The cup she poured steamed in her hands as she settled into the chair by the window. This had been James's chair. She sat in it now as if proximity to where he once rested might bring understanding, might whisper secrets through the worn wood and faded upholstery. The view from the window showed the clearing that fronted the cabin, the meadow beyond, and the trail that wound down through the valley toward what passed for civilization in these parts. Eleanor watched the snow fall across this landscape with eyes that catalogued every movement, every shadow that might indicate an approach. It was another habit learned from James's journal, another transformation from who she had been to who survival demanded she become. The journal itself rested in a locked drawer beneath the window seat, its leather cover worn smooth by her husband's hands. She had read portions of it, the technical descriptions that allowed her to maintain his defensive systems, the practical notes about water sources and game trails, but whole sections remained unexamined, their pages crisp and unopened. The final entries, especially the ones written in the weeks before his death, she could not bring herself to face. Cowardice, perhaps, or wisdom. Eleanor no longer knew the difference. She sipped her coffee and watched the snow and tried not to think about the small locked box she had discovered last winter buried beneath the floorboards of the root cellar. She had not opened it, had not even lifted it from its hiding place. The weight of it glimpsed in lamplight had been enough. Papers, she thought. Documents. Perhaps answers to questions she feared more than ignorance. The day passed in the slow rhythm of isolated living. Eleanor tended the fire, prepared a simple meal she barely tasted, checked the rabbit snares James had positioned around the property, finding 2 caught, and dispatching them with the quick efficiency necessity had taught her. She skinned them on the porch, her hands steady with practice, and hung the meat in the cold room to cure. As afternoon shadows lengthened, she found herself at the window again, cup of cooling tea forgotten in her hands. Something had changed in the clearing, a disturbance in the snow that had not been there an hour ago. Not the tracks of deer or elk, which she knew by heart. These marks showed purpose, showed weight, distributed with the irregular pattern of human movement. Eleanor set down her cup and moved to the cabinet where James had kept his weapons. The rifle came to hand with familiar weight already loaded, as she kept all firearms in the house. She checked the rounds by habit, then positioned herself where she could watch the clearing without being visible from outside. The winter twilight came early to the high country, and in the deepening shadows she saw him, a figure small and moving, with the uncertain gait of exhaustion emerging from the tree line. Not a man, she realized as he drew closer. A child. The boy collapsed 20 yards from her porch. Eleanor's first instinct was caution. The defenses James had built assumed threats would come, disguised as harmless necessity. A child alone in winter could be bait for a trap. But even as her mind calculated risks, her body was already moving. She pulled her shawl tight and stepped into the cold, the rifle left inside, but the small revolver tucked in her pocket. She approached the fallen figure carefully, eyes scanning the tree line for accomplices. But there was only the boy and the snow and the gathering dark. He lay face down, his thin coat inadequate for the killing cold, his hands blue where they clutched at frozen earth. Eleanor knelt beside him and felt for pulse. It fluttered against her fingers, weak but present. She gathered him with an effort. He was older than she first thought, perhaps 11 or 12, all awkward limbs and jutting bones beneath inadequate clothing. She carried him toward the cabin, her breath coming hard with exertion, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Inside, she laid him before the fire and began the work of bringing warmth back to frozen flesh. She had learned this, too, from necessity, from the frontier medicine that left no room for squeamishness. His clothes came off, replaced by blankets warmed by the fire. She chafed his hands and feet, watching for the dangerous flush of frostbite. The boy moaned, consciousness returning in fits and starts. His eyes opened dark and confused, finding her face with the desperate focus of someone clinging to life. "You're safe," Eleanor heard herself say, the words coming from some distant memory of who she used to be. "You're safe now." He tried to speak, but his lips were too cold, too damaged. She brought warm broth to his mouth, coaxing small sips past chattering teeth. Gradually, color returned to his face. His breathing steadied. His eyes, no longer glazed with hypothermia, focused on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She had saved his life. But in doing so, she had violated the first principle of her isolated existence. She had let someone in. The boy slept through that first night, his body claiming the rest it needed to heal. Eleanor sat vigil in James's chair, the rifle now across her lap, watching the child's face in firelight. He looked peaceful in sleep, younger than his years, vulnerable in ways that made her chest ache with something she thought she had buried with her stillborn daughter 3 years ago on the same terrible night she lost James. 7 years ago, before James's darkness consumed him, she had lost their daughter Grace in childbirth. The pain had bonded them, or so she thought, until Copper Creek's ghosts tore him away from her. Grace, she had called her, a name that meant gift, a name that meant mercy. The boy before her now reminded her painfully of the child she might have raised had Grace lived. The thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome, but Eleanor could not push it away. She found herself studying his features, the dark hair that curled against the blanket, the long lashes that lay against pale cheeks. Whose child was he? What circumstances had sent him into the wilderness alone? Morning brought weak sunlight, and the boy's return to consciousness. He woke slowly, eyes opening to study the rough-hewn beams of the cabin ceiling with the careful attention of someone assessing danger. When his gaze found Eleanor, still sitting in her chair with the rifle, he did not flinch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with disuse, "thank you for not letting me die." The formality of it, the adult phrasing from a child's mouth, told Eleanor volumes about his history. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thomas Crawford, but most folks call me Tommy." He sat up slowly, clutching the blankets around his thin frame. "I was looking for someone, got turned around in the storm." "Looking for someone out here." Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "There's nothing for 15 miles but forest and snow. I was told he lived at Deadfall Ridge." Tommy's dark eyes met hers with a directness that spoke of desperation. "A man named Samuel Grant. Do you know him?" The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt her fingers tighten on the rifle's stock. Samuel Grant. She knew that name, knew it in ways that made her mouth go dry and her heart hammer against her ribs. She forced her expression to neutrality, called upon years of school-teacher discipline to keep her voice steady. "Why are you looking for this man?" Tommy's hands twisted in the blankets. "He knew my pa, or that's what they told me at the orphanage when they gave me his letters. My ma died when I was born, and my pa, he disappeared 3 years ago." The letters stopped coming, but the last one he sent mentioned Samuel Grant and this place. Said if anything happened to him, I should find Mr. Grant at Deadfall Ridge. 3 years ago, the same time James died, the same time everything ended, and this terrible silence began. Eleanor stood moving to the window to hide whatever her face might reveal. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I don't know anyone by that name. You've come a long way for nothing." It was not quite a lie. She did know the name Samuel Grant, but the man who had borne it was beyond Tommy's reach, beyond anyone's reach, buried in an unmarked grave in the forest where Eleanor had dragged his body after that terrible night, after she had killed him. The memory came with the force of a physical assault, the weight of the gun in her hand, the sound of the shot impossibly loud in the cabin's confines, the way Samuel Grant had looked at her with surprise and something that might have been understanding as he fell. She had not meant to kill him, had not planned it. But when she had heard the argument between James and the stranger, when she had seen her husband's anguish and the gun in the other man's hand, when Samuel had turned toward her with that strange, sad smile she had fired without thought, James had already been dying when she pulled the trigger, already committed to the path that would end with his own gun and his own confession. But Eleanor had not known that. She had only known that a stranger was threatening her husband, and she had acted to protect him. Only afterward, as she knelt beside both bodies, had she understood the magnitude of her mistake. The conversation she had interrupted was not a threat. Samuel Grant had come to save James, not to harm him. The gun in his hand had been holstered, never drawn. The angry words had been those of a friend trying to prevent a suicide, not an enemy delivering threats. She had killed an innocent man, and then in the cascading horror of that night, she had hidden his body to protect a husband already dead. She had compounded murder with concealment, had buried Samuel Grant in the forest, and let the world believe he had simply vanished. Now his son stood in her cabin looking for a father who lay in an unmarked grave because of her. Eleanor's hands gripped the windowsill until her knuckles showed white. Behind her, she heard Tommy shift, heard the rustle of blankets as he stood. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She could not answer, could not turn to face those trusting dark eyes, while her own betrayal sat like poison on her tongue. The silence stretched between them heavy, with all the words she could never speak. Finally she managed, "You should rest another day before traveling. The snow's too deep to go anywhere safely right now." It was a reprieve, not a solution, but it was all she could offer. The day passed in awkward domesticity. Tommy, once warmed and fed, proved himself useful. He insisted on helping, despite Eleanor's protests, bringing in wood for the fire, checking the water barrel, performing small tasks with the automatic competence of someone long accustomed to making himself needed. Eleanor watched him work and felt her guilt multiply with each passing hour. He was a good boy, polite without servility, quiet without being withdrawn. The kind of child she had once taught, had once believed she might raise. Grace would have been like this, perhaps, curious and capable, finding wonder in small things. When evening came and they sat by the fire with simple soup between them, Tommy spoke again of his search. "My pa was a military engineer," he said, stirring his soup without eating. "That's what the folks at the orphanage told me. Said he worked on fortifications and defenses out west. The letters he sent, they didn't say much, but I could tell he was good at his work. Proud of it even." Eleanor's heart sank further. A military engineer. That explained the sophistication of the trap systems around the cabin. Samuel Grant had helped James build them, or perhaps had built them himself. "The last letter," Tommy continued, "it was different from the others, shorter. He said he had to do something difficult, something that might not end well, but that it was the right thing. And if anything happened, I should find Samuel Grant at Deadfall Ridge." "When did this letter arrive?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "December 1882, 3 years ago. The month James died, the night everything changed." Tommy finally looked up from his soup, his eyes meeting hers with a directness that pierced her defenses. "Ma'am, I think my pa came here. I think something happened to him here, and I think you know what it was." Eleanor's carefully constructed walls trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? How could she explain the inexplicable? Before she could formulate any response, a sound from outside cut through the silence. A mechanical click, sharp and clear in the winter night, one of the perimeter triggers. Someone had crossed the outer boundary of James's defensive system. Eleanor was on her feet instantly, the rifle in her hands, her body moving with the trained responses these 3 years had taught her. She doused the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by firelight. "Stay down," she commanded Tommy, her voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Away from the windows." The boy obeyed without question, dropping to the floor and crawling to the corner she indicated. Eleanor moved to her observation post, the one James had designed, with overlapping sight lines to every approach. Through the series of carefully positioned mirrors, she could see the clearing without exposing herself. 3 figures moving with military precision through the snow, not locals, not trappers or lost travelers. These men moved like soldiers, maintaining proper spacing, checking corners, using hand signals to coordinate their advance. They were looking for something, or someone. Eleanor's mind raced. In 3 years, no one had come looking. No authorities investigating James's death, no military inquiries about missing personnel. She had existed in blessed obscurity alone with her guilt and her secrets. Now, on the same day a boy appeared asking about Samuel Grant, 3 trained men were approaching her cabin. She watched them reach her second perimeter trigger. This one was subtler, designed not to alert her, but to funnel intruders into a specific approach vector. The 3 men took the bait perfectly, adjusting their path to what appeared to be the safest route. It led directly to her primary containment system. Eleanor waited, counting the steps in her head as James's journal had taught her. 3, 2, 1. The night exploded with sound as the pressure plate triggered. The lead man's startled curse was cut short by the snap of the trap mechanism. The deadfall, a carefully weighted net system, descended from the trees with perfect precision. It caught him cleanly, lifting him off his feet to dangle 6 feet above the ground. His 2 companions froze, weapons-drawn eyes, scanning the darkness for the threat. They had been trained well enough not to immediately rush to their comrades' aid, trained well enough to recognize a defensive system when they encountered one, but not trained well enough to spot the secondary trigger they had already crossed. Eleanor watched with grim satisfaction as the ground beneath them collapsed, dumping both men into the pit James had excavated and reinforced 5 years ago. Their shouts of surprise echoed across the clearing, then fell to angry muttering as they realized the pit was too deep to climb without assistance. 3 men neutralized without a shot fired. James's systems worked exactly as designed. Eleanor waited another 10 minutes, watching for any signs of additional personnel. When she was satisfied these 3 were alone, she lit a lantern and stepped onto her porch rifle ready. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the snow, "you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you explain yourselves before I decide you're not worth the effort of releasing." The man in the net twisted, trying to see her. When he spoke, his voice carried the accent of education and command. Mrs. Blackwell, Eleanor Blackwell. The use of her name sent ice through her veins. "Who's asking?" "Sergeant Marcus Stone, United States Army. Or former Army, I should say." The man in the net had gone still, his voice taking on a tone of careful respect. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. I didn't expect to find you alive. The report said you died with your husband in a fire 3 years ago." Another lie from that terrible night. Another thread in the web of deception Eleanor had woven to protect secrets that perhaps should never have been protected. "You're clearly misinformed," she said coldly. "Now explain what you're doing on my property before I leave you there until spring." From the pit, One of the other men called up, "Sarge, this is a military-grade containment system. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Marcus Stone's voice, when he spoke again, carried a new weight of understanding. "Captain Blackwell built these, didn't he? This was his work." Eleanor said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "Mrs. Blackwell," Marcus continued, "I served with your husband. We were in the same unit during the Apache campaigns. I knew him, respected him. When I heard he died, I thought that was the end of it. But 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from Samuel Grant." Eleanor's world tilted. "That's impossible. Samuel Grant has been dead for 3 years. "Yes, ma'am, I know that now. But the letter was dated from before his death. He must have set it up to be delivered if something happened to him. In it, he said Captain Blackwell knew the truth about Copper Creek Massacre, and that someone had to make it right." The name hung in the winter air like a curse. Copper Creek, the words from James's final letter. The secret he had died to protect, or confess Eleanor, still wasn't certain which. "What is Copper Creek?" she asked, though part of her recoiled from finally learning the answer. Marcus Stone's voice dropped heavy with old grief. "It was a massacre, ma'am, in 1881. A small Apache settlement near the Mexican border. 47 people, most of them women and children. Captain Blackwell led the unit that carried it out. Samuel Grant was there, too, as a military engineer. He saw everything, and he could never forget." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. James's nightmares, his increasing isolation, the defensive systems he built as if expecting judgment to arrive at any moment. He had not been protecting Eleanor from bandits or claim jumpers. He had been preparing for the day when his crimes would find him. And Samuel Grant, witness to those crimes, had come not to threaten, but to offer redemption, to convince James to face justice together, to make right what could never truly be made right. Eleanor had killed the only man trying to save her husband's soul. She felt herself sway, the rifle suddenly impossibly heavy in her hands. Behind her, the cabin door opened slightly. Tommy's voice, small and uncertain, drifted into the night. "Mrs. Blackwell, is everything all right?" Marcus Stone twisted in his net, trying to see the cabin. "Who else is there?" Eleanor's mind worked frantically. Tommy could not learn that Samuel Grant was dead, could not learn that his father's body lay somewhere in these woods because of her. She had to protect the boy from that knowledge, even as her own guilt threatened to crush her. "Just a boy who got lost in the storm," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He has nothing to do with this." "A boy?" Marcus's tone shifted, became more urgent. "What's his name?" Eleanor hesitated, but Tommy answered for himself, stepping onto the porch despite her gesture to stay back. "Thomas Crawford, sir. I'm looking for Samuel Grant. He was a friend of my pa's." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Marcus Stone spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Son, what was your father's name?" "Samuel Grant, sir." Another long pause. Then Marcus said quietly, "God help us all. You're Samuel's boy." Eleanor felt the world narrow to a single point of terrible clarity. The boy on her porch, the man in the net, the two in the pit, all of them connected by threads of history and blood to the body she had buried in the forest, all of them unknowing witnesses to her guilt. Tommy's voice rose with desperate hope. "You know my pa. You know where he is." Marcus Stone looked at Eleanor, and even in the darkness and distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze. He knew she realized, or suspected. The timing, the circumstances, the defensive systems built by Samuel Grant and James Blackwell together. A man of Marcus Stone's experience could add those elements and reach an inescapable conclusion. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said carefully, "I think we need to talk, all of us, about what really happened 3 years ago." Eleanor's hands tightened on her rifle. She could shoot him now, shoot them all, 3 more bodies to bury, 3 more secrets to keep. But Tommy stood on the porch behind her, and she could not kill a man in front of the son of the man she had already killed. The web she had woven was collapsing. The silence she had maintained for 3 years was finally breaking. She lowered her rifle. "Come down at dawn," she said, her voice empty of everything but exhaustion. "I'll release you then, and I'll tell you everything you want to know." She turned and walked back to the cabin, past Tommy's confused face, past the questions she could see forming on his lips. Inside, she bolted the door and leaned against it, feeling the full weight of 3 years' guilt finally crushing down upon her. In the corner, James's journal waited in its locked drawer. In the root cellar, the small box of evidence lay hidden. In the forest, Samuel Grant's body rested in its unmarked grave. And in her heart, the truth she had buried with him finally demanded its reckoning. Outside, she heard Marcus Stone calling instructions to his men, heard them settling in for a cold night, accepting her terms because they had no choice. They would wait for dawn, wait for answers. And Eleanor, standing in the cabin where her husband had died and her daughter had been born, stillborn, knew that dawn would bring the end of her silence, the end of her secrets, the end of everything she had tried to protect. She looked at Tommy, who watched her with those dark eyes so like his father's, and felt her carefully constructed world crack completely apart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to the boy, to Samuel Grant's memory, or to her own lost innocence she could not say. The fire burned low. The snow continued to fall. And in Deadfall Ridge, the truth that had been buried for 3 winters finally began its resurrection. Dawn came reluctantly to Deadfall Ridge, as if the sun itself hesitated to illuminate what the night had hidden. Eleanor stood at her window, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, watching the first gray light touch the clearing where 3 men waited in the cold. She had not slept, had not even tried. The hours between midnight and morning had stretched like years, each minute weighted with the knowledge that her carefully guarded silence would soon be broken. Behind her, Tommy slept on a pallet near the fire, his breathing deep and even with the thoughtless peace of youth. She envied him that peace. Knew it would not survive the day. Eleanor set down her cup and pulled on her heavy coat. The rifle she left by the door. Whatever was coming, bullets would not solve it. She had learned that lesson 3 years ago, when a single shot had created more problems than a lifetime of silence could contain. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she crossed to where Marcus Stone hung in his net, his 2 companions still trapped in the pit beyond. The sergeant looked worse for his night of exposure, his face pale with cold, his lips tinged blue. But his eyes remained alert, watchful, assessing her with the careful attention of a man accustomed to measuring threats. "You're either very confident or very foolish to come out here alone," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Or very tired," Eleanor replied. She began working the release mechanism James had built into the trap system. "Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of carrying secrets that were never mine to keep." The net descended smoothly, lowering Marcus to the ground, with the controlled precision of military engineering. He stood slowly, working circulation back into cramped limbs, never taking his eyes from her face. "Where did you learn to operate systems like this?" he asked. "My husband left detailed journals. I'm a quick study when survival depends on it." Eleanor moved to the pit where the other 2 men waited. "Your friends have names, Private Chen and Private Davis. Good men both. Former Army like me." She operated the second release, and a rope ladder unrolled into the pit. The 2 men climbed out with military efficiency, their movements speaking of training that went deeper than thought. They flanked Marcus automatically, forming a defensive triangle that marked them as veterans of real combat. "You can come to the cabin," Eleanor said. "There's coffee and food. And answers, though, I doubt you'll like them any better than I do." She turned and walked back without checking if they followed. Behind her, she heard the soft crunch of snow that said they had accepted her invitation, or her surrender. At this point, the difference seemed meaningless. Inside, Tommy was awake, stirring the fire and adding wood with the practiced movements of someone long accustomed to making himself useful. He looked up as Eleanor entered with 3 strange men behind her, and something in the boy's expression made her heart ache. He was hoping she realized, hoping that these men might have answers about his father, hoping that his long search might finally end. It would end, Eleanor knew, but not the way Tommy wanted. She poured coffee for the 3 men, served them the cornbread and bacon she had prepared in the pre-dawn darkness when her hands needed something to do besides shake. They ate with the focused intensity of men who had spent a cold night outdoors, but Marcus never stopped watching her, waiting. Finally, when the food was gone and only coffee remained, Eleanor sat in James's chair and faced them. "You said you received a letter from Samuel Grant," she began. "What did it say exactly?" Marcus reached into his coat and withdrew a worn envelope. He handed it to Eleanor without comment. The paper felt fragile in her hands, as if the words it contained were too heavy for mere paper to bear. She read in silence. Samuel's handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the careful attention of an engineer accustomed to clarity. The date at the top made her stomach clench. December 15th, 1882, 3 days before that terrible night. Marcus, the letter began, "If you're reading this, then I'm likely dead, and James Blackwell may be as well. I need you to understand what happened at Copper Creek because someone has to make it right. Someone has to speak for the 47 people who can't speak for themselves anymore." The letter went on to detail the massacre with clinical precision, the orders that came from Colonel Harrison Wade, later Senator Wade, the false intelligence about Apache hostilities that justified a military response, the reality of what James's unit found when they arrived, a peaceful settlement of families, not warriors. And what happened next? Eleanor's hands trembled as she read Samuel's account. Women shot while trying to shield their children, old men executed as they knelt in prayer, the systematic destruction of a people whose only crime was existing on land that contained silver deposits Colonel Wade wanted to claim. James had led the attack, had given the orders, had pulled the trigger himself more than once. Samuel's letter did not flinch from these facts, but it also detailed what came after. James's increasing horror as he understood what he had done, his nightmares, his descent into a guilt that consumed him from within. "I tried to convince him to go to the authorities together," Samuel wrote, "to face what we had witnessed, what he had done. James refused. He said he would protect me, that I had a son to think about, that my testimony alone might be enough to bring Wade to justice. But I know the truth. James is planning to kill himself, and I can't let him die alone with his guilt. So I'm going to Deadfall Ridge to try one last time to save him, not from justice but from despair. If this letter reaches you, I failed. Please, Marcus, finish what James and I could not. Make Copper Creek mean something." Eleanor looked up to find Marcus watching her with eyes that held sympathy and something harder. Judgment, perhaps? Or simply the cold assessment of a man who had seen too much to be shocked by human weakness. "Samuel went to save your husband," Marcus said quietly. "Not to threaten him, not to blackmail him, to save him." "I know," Eleanor whispered. The admission cost her everything, but it was also a relief to finally speak it aloud. "I know that now, but I didn't know it then." Tommy had gone very still by the fire. Eleanor could feel his attention, could sense the questions building behind his careful silence. But it was Marcus who spoke next. What happened that night, Mrs. Blackwell? And so Eleanor told them. Told them about coming home to find James slumped in his chair, the gun on the floor, the letter burning in his hand. Told them about Samuel Grant arriving moments after, about the argument she had heard but not understood, about the gun in her hand and the terrible mistake she had made. "I thought he was threatening James," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I didn't know James was already dying, didn't know he had taken poison before Samuel arrived. I just saw a stranger with a gun, and I heard my husband in distress, and I acted without thinking." "Where is he?" Marcus asked. "Where did you bury Samuel?" "In the forest, half a mile east of here. I'll show you." "And your husband?" "The report said you both died in a fire." "I started that fire. Burned everything I could to make it look like we had died together. I thought if everyone believed we were dead, the questions would stop. The investigation would end. I could protect James's memory and hide what I had done to Samuel." She looked at Tommy, then forced herself to meet those dark eyes that held his father's intensity. "I killed your father, Tommy, not because he was bad, not because he deserved it, but because I was frightened and foolish and I didn't understand what was really happening. I've lived with that guilt every day since. It's why I stayed here alone, why I never touched the copper beneath this land, why I put a bullet on my husband's grave every week, because I took something that could never be returned, and there's no penance sufficient for that." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for Tommy's response. The boy stood slowly. His face had gone pale, making his dark eyes seem even larger. He looked at Eleanor for a long moment, then walked to the door and out into the snow without a word. Eleanor moved to follow, but Marcus caught her arm. "Let him go," he said gently. "He needs time to process this. We all do." Chen, who had been silent throughout, spoke for the first time. The boy went east, toward the tree line. "He'll find his father's grave," Eleanor said. "I marked it. Nothing formal, just a cairn of stones. I couldn't leave him completely unmarked." Davis stood and moved to the window, his military training evident in the way he checked sight lines and approaches. "Sergeant, we have movement. 2 riders on the south ridge." Marcus was at the window in an instant, his body tense with sudden alertness. Eleanor joined them, following Davis's pointing finger to where 2 figures sat their horses at the edge of visibility. "They're not trying to hide," Chen observed. "They want us to see them." "Which means they're not alone," Marcus said grimly. "Standard military reconnaissance. They're spotting for a larger force." Eleanor felt ice settle in her stomach. "Who would send men here? The Army." "Are you still investigating Copper Creek?" "No." Marcus's voice was tight. "My investigation is unofficial, personal. The Army closed the Copper Creek file years ago, classified the whole incident, and buried it deep." He turned to look at her with new urgency. "But you said James's letter mentioned Colonel Wade. He's Senator Wade now, a powerful man with political ambitions. If word got out about Copper Creek, it would destroy him." "You think he sent those men?" "I think Samuel's letter wasn't the only one with delayed delivery. I think someone knew he was planning to expose Wade, and they've been waiting to see if anyone would follow up." Marcus was already moving, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "How many defensive positions do you have around this property?" "James built 5 containment systems. You found 2 of them last night." Eleanor's mind was racing, calculating odds and outcomes with a speed that surprised her. "But they're designed for small numbers. If Wade sent a professional team, then we need to prepare for a siege." Marcus looked at his 2 men. "Chen, check the perimeter. I want to know how many we're facing. Davis, inventory our weapons and ammunition. Mrs. Blackwell, I need to see your husband's defensive plans. All of them." Eleanor moved to the locked drawer and retrieved James's journal. She had never read the tactical sections in detail, had only studied enough to maintain the systems. Now she spread the pages on the table, revealing diagrams and calculations that spoke of a brilliant military mind applied to defensive engineering. Marcus studied them with growing respect. "Your husband was expecting something like this. These systems aren't designed to kill, they're designed to contain and delay. He was buying time." "Time for what?" "For evidence to reach the right people." Marcus looked up at her with sudden intensity. "Mrs. Blackwell, your husband didn't just leave defensive systems. He left insurance. Somewhere in this cabin there's proof of what happened at Copper Creek. Proof that implicates Wade. That's what Samuel was coming to collect. That's what Wade's men are here to destroy." Eleanor's breath caught. The box. The locked box in the root cellar that she had never opened. "Follow me," she said. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. Eleanor descended the ladder with Marcus close behind their lamps, casting dancing shadows on earthen walls. The space was larger than it appeared from above, extending beneath the entire cabin in a network of storage chambers that James had excavated with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. Eleanor led Marcus to the furthest chamber, where a section of wall looked no different from the rest. She counted stones from the corner, pressed 3 in sequence, and watched as a hidden panel swung open to reveal a small cavity. Inside sat a metal box, no larger than a book secured with a combination lock. "I found this last winter," Eleanor said. "I've never opened it. I was afraid of what it might contain." "Can you open it now?" Eleanor's fingers moved over the lock. She had never tried the combination, but some instinct made her enter the date of their wedding. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal that was not James's. Marcus lifted the journal carefully. The cover bore a name stamped in gold. Captain James Blackwell, official record. "This is his war diary," Marcus breathed. "These were supposed to be destroyed after the Apache campaigns ended. Wade ordered all unit diaries classified and burned." Eleanor unwrapped the photographs. They showed scenes of devastation, bodies lying in the street of a small settlement. Women, children, old men. The horror of Copper Creek captured in permanent silver and shadow. James documented everything, she whispered. He kept proof of what Wade ordered him to do. The letters were correspondence between James and Colonel Wade, detailing orders to eliminate the Apache settlement, to make it look like a response to hostilities to ensure no survivors could contradict the official report. Wade's signature appeared on every order, his seal authenticating each command. "This is enough," Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion. "This is enough to bring Wade down, to reopen the investigation, to give those 47 people justice." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. James had not been simply hiding his guilt. He had been preserving evidence, planning even in his darkest moments to make things right. "But Samuel," she said. "Samuel came here to get this, to help James deliver it to the authorities. And You made a mistake," Marcus interrupted gently. "A terrible mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Samuel would understand that. He knew the risk he was taking. He came anyway because he believed in justice more than he feared death." "How can you know that?" "Because I knew Samuel Grant. We served together before he was assigned to James's unit. He was the best man I ever knew, and he would not want his death to bury the truth about Copper Creek." A shout from above cut through their conversation, Chen's voice urgent and alarmed. Marcus and Eleanor scrambled up the ladder to find Chen at the window, his face tight with concern. "We've got company, Sergeant. 7 riders coming in fast from the west. They're armed and organized, military formation." Eleanor moved to her mirror system, the one that gave her overlapping views of every approach. Through the angled glass, she could see them clearly now. 7 men on horseback moving with the coordinated precision of professional soldiers. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing marked them as clearly as any uniform. The lead rider was older than the others, perhaps 50, with the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent his life outdoors. He raised his hand, and the group halted at the edge of the clearing, in perfect unison. The discipline of the movement was almost beautiful in its precision. "Mrs. Blackwell," the lead rider called out, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "My name is Nathaniel Cross. I represent certain interests that would like to discuss your property." Eleanor felt Marcus tense beside her. "Cross," he muttered. "I know that name. He was a scout years ago, highly skilled. Went private after the army." "What kind of private work?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The kind that doesn't ask questions about legality. If Wade hired Cross, he's not here to negotiate." Cross called out again. "I understand you've had some excitement here. Federal men asking questions about old history. That's unfortunate. My employer would prefer that history stay buried. I'm authorized to offer generous compensation for your cooperation." "And if I don't cooperate," Eleanor called back, "then I'm afraid things become significantly less pleasant for everyone involved." Marcus was studying the men through the mirror system. "They're good. See how they're positioned, covering all the approaches we might use to escape. But they don't know about your husband's defensive systems yet. The traps won't hold 7 trained men for long. We don't need long. We need time to get this evidence somewhere safe." Marcus turned to Davis. "You're the fastest rider. Can you make it to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe? 3 days hard riding, Sergeant. Then you leave now. Take the evidence, ride like hell, and don't stop for anything." Eleanor shook her head. "They'll see him leave. They'll run him down. Not if we give them something else to focus on." Marcus smiled grimly. "Your husband built these systems to delay and contain. Let's see how well they work against professionals." He moved to the table where James's diagrams lay spread out. "According to these plans, your husband integrated multiple layers of defense. The outer perimeter has detection systems. The middle ring has containment traps. But there's a third layer, isn't there? Something more serious." Eleanor nodded slowly. "James called them the deterrent systems. I've never activated them. They're designed to do more than contain." "Show me." She pointed to a section of the diagram that showed the southern approach, the one Cross and his men would likely use if they decided to attack. James had installed a series of spring-loaded mechanisms there, hidden beneath innocent-looking ground. When triggered, they would release a barrage of wooden stakes angled to strike at horse height. "It won't kill them," Eleanor said. "James designed everything to incapacitate, not eliminate, but it will stop a charge. That's all we need." Marcus looked at his men. "Davis, get ready to ride. Chen, you and I will activate the perimeter systems. Mrs. Blackwell." "Where's the boy?" Eleanor's heart clenched. In the chaos, She had forgotten about Tommy. He went east, toward his father's grave. Then we need to get him back here, now. Marcus was already moving toward the door. If Cross decides to take hostages... The sound of a gunshot cut through his words, not close but not far enough away. From the east, where Tommy had gone. Eleanor was moving before thought, grabbing her rifle and plunging out into the snow. Behind her, she heard Marcus shouting orders, but the words meant nothing. Tommy was out there, and if Cross's men had found him, she ran through the forest following the path she knew by heart. The path to Samuel Grant's unmarked grave. Snow caught at her skirts, branches tore at her face, but she did not slow. Could not slow. She burst into the small clearing to find Tommy standing over the cairn of stones that marked his father's resting place. The boy held a revolver in both hands, pointed at a figure who stood with his hands raised. One of Cross's men, younger than the others, with a face that still held the softness of relative youth. "Tommy," Eleanor said carefully, her rifle trained on the stranger. "What happened?" "He was following me," Tommy said, his voice surprisingly steady for someone holding a gun for what was likely the first time. "I heard him, waited behind a tree. When he came close enough, I took his gun." "Smart boy," the young man said. His accent marked him as Eastern educated. "No need for anyone to get hurt here. I was just scouting, that's all." "Scouting what?" Eleanor demanded. "Cross wants to know the layout, how many people are in the cabin, what kind of resistance we might face." He looked at Tommy with something that might have been respect. "Didn't expect to find a kid with that much sand." "This is my pa's grave," Tommy said quietly. Nobody was going to disturb it. The young man's expression shifted, something uncomfortable crossing his features. "Your pa?" "This here, Samuel Grant. He was a good man, a hero." Tommy's voice broke slightly on the last word. "And Mrs. Blackwell killed him." Eleanor flinched, as if struck. The words spoken aloud in daylight felt even more damning than they had in the cabin's confession. "That true?" the young man asked her. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I killed him. It was a mistake, but that doesn't change what I did." "And you've been living here alone ever since, with that on your conscience. Alone seems like the least I deserve." The young man studied her for a long moment, then looked back at Tommy. "Son, I don't know what happened here 3 years ago, but I do know that Cross and the rest, they're not here for justice or truth. They're here to bury things, make sure certain people's reputations stay clean. If that means burying you and her and anyone else who knows too much, they'll do it without losing sleep." "Why are you telling us this?" Eleanor asked. "Because I signed on thinking this was a simple property dispute. Cross said we were just here to convince a widow to sell her land. But I've been listening to the talk. I know what Copper Creek was, and I'm not about to help cover up the murder of 47 innocent people." He lowered his hands slowly. "Name's Garrett. I was Army 2 couple years back. Got out when I realized the brass cared more about politics than honor. Cross offered good money for simple work, but this ain't simple anymore." Marcus appeared at the edge of the clearing, his rifle ready. He took in the scene, his tactical mind clearly processing the dynamics. "He's telling the truth," Tommy said. "I can feel it." "Feelings ain't reliable in situations like this," Marcus said, but he lowered his rifle slightly. "Still, we could use another gun if you're offering it." Garrett nodded. "I'm offering. Cross has 6 men besides me, all experienced, but they don't know about your defensive systems yet. I can tell you how they're planning to approach." "Why should we trust you?" Eleanor asked. "Because my ma raised me to know right from wrong. And helping Wade cover up Copper Creek is wrong. Whatever happened between you and Samuel Grant, that's between you and God. But those 47 people deserve better than to be forgotten because a senator wants to protect his career." Marcus made a decision. "All right. But if this is a trick..." "It's not," Garrett said simply. "I'll prove it. Cross is planning to move at dusk. He thinks darkness will give him advantage. He's wrong, isn't he? That's when your traps work best." Eleanor nodded slowly. James had designed every system with night operations in mind, with mechanisms that relied on sound and movement rather than sight. "Then we have until dusk to prepare," Marcus said, "and to get Davis clear with the evidence." They moved back through the forest together, an unlikely alliance forged by necessity and moral conviction. Tommy walked close to Eleanor, not touching, but not distant either. The boy's presence was a physical ache, a reminder of what she had taken and could never return. When they reached the cabin, Marcus gathered everyone for a tactical briefing. Davis was packed and ready, the metal box secured in his saddlebags. Chen had completed his perimeter check and reported back with confirming intelligence that matched Garrett's account. 6 men besides Garrett, Chen said, all armed with modern rifles. They're setting up a camp just beyond the South Ridge. 1 man is staying with the horses. The other 5 will come at dusk from multiple angles. Eleanor spread James's diagrams on the table. If we activate systems here, here, and here, we can funnel them into these zones. The traps will contain 3, maybe 4 of them, but at least 1 or 2 will get through. Then we make our stand in the cabin, Marcus said. It's defensible. Good sight lines, Mrs. Blackwell, did your husband prepare any interior defenses? Eleanor thought of the modifications James had made to the cabin itself. The reinforced shutters, the narrow firing ports disguised as decorative elements, the fact that the chimney could be blocked to fill the surrounding area with smoke. He turned the cabin into a fortress, she said. We can hold it for a while, but not indefinitely. We don't need indefinitely. We just need until Davis reaches Santa Fe. Marcus looked at his man. 3 days. Can you do it? I'll do it or die trying, Sergeant. Don't die. Get there. Get the evidence to Governor Martinez. Tell him everything. He's an honest man. He'll act on it. Davis nodded and moved toward the door. Eleanor stopped him, reached into her pocket, and withdrew the letter Samuel Grant had written to Marcus. Take this too, she said. It's Samuel's testimony, in his own words. His son deserves to know his father died trying to do the right thing. Tommy looked up at her, his dark eyes unreadable. You're helping bring justice for Copper Creek, even though it means admitting what you did to my pa. I owe your father at least that much, Eleanor said quietly. I can't give him back his life, can't undo my mistake, but I can make sure his death meant something. The boy's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, Eleanor knew. She did not deserve forgiveness and would not insult Tommy by expecting it, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, perhaps the recognition that people could be both guilty and trying to do better. Davis slipped out through the back entrance James had built for exactly this purpose, a concealed door that opened into a natural ravine, offering cover all the way to the northern tree line. They watched through the mirrors as he moved, saw him reach his horse, saw him mount and ride north with the controlled speed of someone balancing urgency with the need for stealth. Cross's men did not react. They were focused on the cabin on the front approaches. Davis had a clear path, at least for now. Now we wait, Marcus said. The hours until dusk stretched like days. Eleanor prepared food that no one ate, checked and rechecked weapons that were already ready, moved through the cabin in patterns that had become reflexive over 3 years of isolated living. Tommy sat by the window watching the tree line. Garrett joined him after a while, speaking quietly. Eleanor could not hear their words but could see the way Tommy's posture gradually relaxed. The boy needed allies his own age, she thought. Needed to know that not all adults were carrying the weight of terrible mistakes. Marcus pulled Eleanor aside as afternoon shadows lengthened. Whatever happens tonight, he said quietly, Samuel's death won't be for nothing. The truth about Copper Creek will come out. Wade will face justice, and you'll have to face consequences too. I can't protect you from that. I don't want protection, Eleanor said. I want to do the right thing even if it's years too late. Your husband felt the same way, in the end. Marcus held up James's journal. I've been reading his entries from those last weeks. He was planning this, planning to expose Wade, planning to turn himself in. Samuel was coming to help him do it, and I killed the only person trying to save him. You didn't know. That has to count for something. Does it? Eleanor looked out at the gathering darkness. I acted out of fear and ignorance. Those 47 people at Copper Creek died because men acted out of greed and prejudice. Different motivations, same result. Innocent people dead because someone didn't think before pulling a trigger. There's a difference between murder and mistake. Tell that to Tommy. Tell that to Samuel Grant's grave. Marcus had no answer for that. There was no answer. Some things could not be reasoned away or justified. They could only be carried. The last light was fading from the sky when Chen reported movement. Cross and his 5 men were mounting up, preparing for their assault. They moved with military precision, each man checking his weapons, his equipment, his assigned position in the formation. Eleanor watched them through her mirrors and felt a strange calm settle over her. Fear would have been reasonable. Terror would have been justified. Instead, she felt only a cold clarity. These men were coming to silence the truth, to bury evidence of a massacre, to protect a senator who had ordered the deaths of 47 innocent people. She would not let them. Marcus positioned everyone, Chen at the east window with a clear field of fire, Garrett at the west where his knowledge of Cross's tactics would be most useful. Tommy in the safest position, the interior room where James had reinforced the walls and ceiling. The boy protested, but Eleanor's look silenced him. "Your father died for the truth," she said. "Don't make his sacrifice meaningless by getting yourself killed before it can come out." Tommy nodded reluctantly and retreated to the protected space. Eleanor took her position at the north window, her rifle loaded with the specialized ammunition James had crafted for exactly this purpose, rounds designed to disable rather than kill. Even now, even facing men who would show her no mercy, she found herself unable to cross that final line. She had killed once. It had cost her everything. She would not do it again unless absolutely necessary. The first trigger activated with a sound like a branch snapping. One of Cross's men approaching from the south had stepped on a pressure plate. The mechanism responded instantly, a weighted net dropping from the trees to ensnare him. His startled curse carried clearly across the snow, Cross's voice calm and professional. "Hold positions. Assess the trap." But already the second man had triggered another system, this one, a ground collapse that dropped him into a pit 6 feet deep. Not fatal, not even necessarily injurious, but completely effective at removing him from the assault. "They've got defensive systems," Cross called to his remaining men. "Military grade. Everyone goes to backup protocols. Spacing at 20 yards. Watch your foot placement." 2 men down 4, still mobile, including Cross himself. They adjusted their approach, moving more carefully now, testing ground before committing weight. It slowed them, but did not stop them. Eleanor watched through her mirrors as Cross himself approached the western perimeter. He was good, she had to admit. His movements showed the instincts of someone who had spent years in hostile territory. He avoided the obvious paths, tested suspicious ground, kept his attention divided between the cabin and his surroundings. But he did not know that James had built redundant systems, that every obvious trap had a backup, that the ground Cross was testing, satisfied was safe, was actually the trigger for a different mechanism entirely. The spring-loaded barrier erupted from the earth with pneumatic force, a wall of wooden stakes that shot upward in Cross's path. His horse reared, throwing him. He hit the ground hard, the impact audible even from the cabin. The horse bolted, leaving Cross sprawled in the snow. 3 down, 3 still advancing. Marcus fired from the east window a warning shot that struck the ground inches from where one of Cross's men crouched behind a tree. The message was clear. "We see you. We can hit you if we choose." The man retreated, seeking better cover, and in doing so triggered another of James's systems. This one was simpler, just a tripwire connected to a bell that rang clearly in the night. Not harmful, but loud enough to shatter stealth and mark position. The assault was breaking down. What should have been a coordinated strike by experienced men had become a series of isolated struggles against an enemy they could not see, fighting defenses they could not predict. Cross, back on his feet despite the fall, called for retreat. Pullback reform at the rally point. His remaining men obeyed with the disciplined response of professionals. They withdrew in good order, covering each other, moving to retrieve their trapped companions. Eleanor could have fired, could have picked off at least one, but she held her shot. They were beaten for now. That was enough. In the cabin, Marcus allowed himself a tight smile. "Your husband knew his business. That was textbook defensive engineering. He learned it in hell," Eleanor said quietly. "Copper Creek taught him what men were capable of when they followed wrong orders. He made sure no one would follow wrong orders here." Tommy emerged from the interior room, his face pale but determined. "They'll come back, won't they? This isn't over." "No," Marcus agreed. "This isn't over." Cross works for Wade. He won't give up just because the first assault failed. He'll regroup, reassess, come at us differently." "How long until he tries again?" Garrett asked. "Until tomorrow night at earliest. He needs daylight to scout our defenses properly now that he knows they exist. And his men need rest. That fall Cross took, he'll be feeling that. He's not a young man anymore." Eleanor moved to secure the cabin checking locks and reinforcements. Outside, she could hear Cross's men collecting their injured companions, could hear the low murmur of conversation as they discussed what had gone wrong. Part of her wanted to feel triumph at their defeat. Instead, she felt only exhaustion. How many more times would she have to defend this ground? How many more times would men come seeking to bury truth beneath violence? James had prepared for siege, but even the best defenses eventually failed. Eventually, the attackers found a way through. She looked at Tommy, who had returned to his window post despite the immediate danger passing. The boy stared out into darkness, his profile so like his father's that it made her heart ache. He was brave, she thought. Braver than she had been. Facing terrible truths about his father's death, about the world's casual cruelty, and still standing, still fighting. She owed him the same courage. Owed him the truth complete and unvarnished, no matter what it cost her. "Tommy," she said quietly, "come sit with me." The boy turned, surprise evident in his dark eyes. He had not expected kindness from her, did not know what to do with it. "Please," Eleanor added, "there are things you need to know. About your father. About that night. About who I really am." He came slowly settling onto the bench opposite her chair. Marcus and the others gave them space, moving to other parts of the cabin to maintain watch while granting them privacy. Eleanor took a breath and began to speak. Told Tommy everything. About James's nightmares. About finding him dead. About Samuel arriving in the darkness. About the moment, the terrible moment, when fear and misunderstanding had led her to pull a trigger. "Your father came to save James," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Not to hurt him, not to threaten him. Samuel was trying to convince James to turn himself in to face justice for Copper Creek together. He thought if they both testified, they could bring down the man who had ordered the massacre. Senator Wade." Tommy listened in silence, his young face grave with concentration. "But I didn't know any of that," Eleanor continued. "I heard angry voices, saw a stranger with a weapon near my dying husband, and I reacted. I murdered your father out of ignorance and fear." "Why are you telling me this?" Tommy asked finally. "Because you deserve to know the truth, all of it. Not the version I tell myself to sleep at night, but the real truth. Your father was a hero. He was trying to do the right thing, and I killed him for it." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was smaller, younger than it had been. "Pa used to write me letters before he stopped. He'd tell me about his work, about the places he'd seen, but mostly he'd tell me about doing what was right, even when it was hard. He said that's what made someone a good man, not never making mistakes, but facing them when you did." Eleanor waited, knowing there was more. "You made a mistake," Tommy said slowly. "A really bad one, but you're facing it now, helping to get the truth out about Copper Creek. Helping to stop Senator Wade. That's what Pa would want. Not revenge, justice." "I don't deserve your understanding," Eleanor whispered. "Maybe not. But Pa's not here to speak for himself, so I have to decide what I think he'd want, and I think he'd want his death to mean something, to help stop Wade, to give those 47 people justice." Tommy met her eyes directly. "I'm not saying I forgive you, Mrs. Blackwell. I don't know if I can, but I'm saying I understand why you're doing this now, why you're helping." It was more grace than Eleanor had any right to expect. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. They sat together in silence as full darkness settled over Deadfall Ridge. Outside, Cross and his men made camp visible fires marking their position. Inside, Eleanor and her unlikely allies prepared for whatever would come next. But for this moment, this single moment, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Not forgiveness, which she knew she would never earn, not redemption, which remained impossibly distant, but something smaller and perhaps more precious. The beginning of honest reckoning. The first step on a long path toward making terrible wrongs somehow impossibly slightly less wrong. It was not much. But for a woman who had lived in silence for so long, it was everything. Night settled over Deadfall Ridge with the weight of judgment itself. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the fires burning in Cross's camp on the South Ridge. 7 distinct points of flame marked positions around her property, a constellation of threat that spoke to professional military planning. Behind those 7 visible fires, she knew waited more men. Reinforcements that Cross had called in after his first assault failed. The cabin held an uneasy quiet. Marcus and Chen spoke in whispers near the eastern wall, their voices carrying the clipped efficiency of soldiers preparing for battle. Garrett sat with Tommy by the fire, the young mercenary, teaching the boy how to check a rifle's action, how to clear a jam, how to stay calm when fear demanded panic. Skills no child should need, yet skills that had already kept Tommy alive through one siege. Eleanor turned from the window and moved to the cabinet where James had kept his war diary. The journal lay open on the table now, its pages revealing the detailed engineering specifications for his final defensive measure. She had read these entries 3 times in the past hour, memorizing sequences and calculations, preparing herself for what had to be done. "Mrs. Blackwell." Tommy's voice pulled her from concentration. The boy stood beside her, his dark eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper. Determination, perhaps, or the kind of courage that came from having nothing left to lose. "You should rest," Eleanor said gently. "We have hours yet before Cross moves again." "I can't rest. Every time I close my eyes I see my pa. Wonder what he looked like, what his voice sounded like." Tommy's hands twisted together. "I never knew him, and now I never will, because of what you did." The accusation hung between them, simple and devastating. Eleanor did not flinch from it, could not. The boy deserved her unflinching acknowledgement of the wound she had carved into his life. "No," she agreed quietly. "You'll never know him, and that's a loss I can never repair no matter how long I live or how hard I try to make amends. But you're trying anyway?" "Trying is all I have left. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's honest." Tommy studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. A wooden soldier crudely carved but crafted with evident care. The paint had worn away in places, revealing the pale wood beneath. "The orphanage gave this to me when I was 6. Said my pa carved it before I was born, left it with instructions to give it to me when I was old enough to understand what a soldier was." He held the small figure in his palm, turning it to catch the light. "I used to think it meant he wanted me to be brave like a soldier, but now I know different. He wanted me to understand what soldiers do, the good and the terrible both." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. This boy, carrying his father's gift and the weight of truths too heavy for young shoulders, possessed a wisdom that shamed her. "Your father was brave," she said. "He came here knowing he might die, came anyway because he believed truth mattered more than safety. And you killed him for it." "Yes, I did." The simplicity of the admission seemed to satisfy something in Tommy. He nodded slowly and returned the wooden soldier to his pocket. "When this is over, when we've stopped Senator Wade and brought justice for Copper Creek, what happens to you? I'll face charges for your father's death, murder most likely. The law doesn't distinguish much between intentional killing and fatal mistakes." "Will they hang you?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "Possibly. That will be for a judge and jury to decide. But whatever they decide, I'll accept it. Your father deserves that much justice." "Even if I don't want them to hang you?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She searched Tommy's face for mockery or cruelty, but found only genuine confusion. The boy was struggling with something, wrestling with emotions too complex for easy resolution. "Why wouldn't you want justice for your father?" she asked carefully. "Because hanging you won't bring him back, won't let me know him, won't change anything except making another person dead." Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "Pa died trying to do the right thing. Would he want me to want revenge, or would he want something better?" Before Eleanor could answer, Marcus called from the window. "Movement, at all positions. They're preparing something." Everyone converged on observation posts. Through her mirror system, Eleanor counted figures moving with coordinated precision around the perimeter. Not 7 men now, at least 15, maybe more, advancing through pre-dawn darkness with military discipline. Cross brought serious reinforcements, Chen observed. Those are professionals, former military, all of them. Which means Wade is getting desperate, Marcus said grimly. He knows Davis has reached Santa Fe by now, knows the evidence is in play. This is his last chance to silence us before the truth spreads too far to contain. Eleanor's mind calculated rapidly. 15 men against their 5, one of whom was an 11-year-old boy. The defensive systems James had built would slow. The attackers might contain a few, but would not stop a force this size and this well-trained, unless she activated the final measure, the one James had prepared for exactly this scenario. She moved to the trapdoor leading to the root cellar, her decision made. Marcus, you and Chen hold the perimeter as long as possible. Make them think we're preparing for a conventional defense. Garrett, you're with me. We're going below to implement James's final system. The collapse... Garrett's face paled slightly. You're certain? We're out of options, and out of time. Eleanor turned to Tommy, kneeling so their eyes were level. Listen carefully. In a few hours, this entire hillside is going to come down. The cabin will drop into a protected cavity James built beneath us. There's a reinforced room in the back where you'll be completely safe. But you have to stay there. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay in that room. Do you understand? Tommy's jaw set with stubborn determination. I understand, but I'm not hiding while everyone else fights. You're not hiding. You're surviving. Someone has to live to tell the truth about what happened here, about your father, about Copper Creek. That's not cowardice, Tommy. That's carrying the most important mission of all. The boy's eyes glistened, but he nodded. I'll stay. I promise. Eleanor embraced him quickly, fiercely, then stood and descended into the darkness below with Garrett following close behind. The cavity beneath the cabin was exactly as James's diagrams had described. A natural chamber enlarged by careful excavation, its ceiling supported by 23 massive timber columns positioned with mathematical precision. Each column bore a number carved into its base. Each number corresponded to a specific sequence in James's removal plan. We have to weaken them in order, Eleanor explained, holding the diagram to lamplight. Cut here, brace there, prepare the entire structure before removing the final trigger column. If we do it wrong, the cabin crushes instead of settling safely. And if we do it right. The hillside collapses inward, burying everything on the surface while the cabin drops into this protected space. James calculated every angle. It should work. Should is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Eleanor managed a grim smile. Welcome to life with James Blackwell. Everything was calculated, precise, and accompanied by the nagging certainty that one miscalculation would kill everyone. They began with column 1. Garrett saw bit into old-growth timber while Eleanor held the lamp and consulted the diagram. The work was brutal, each cut requiring sustained effort against wood that James had selected specifically for its strength. But gradually they found a rhythm. Cut, brace, move to the next position. Above them, the sounds of siege filtered through the cabin floor. Sporadic gunfire as Cross's men probed defenses. Marcus and Chen returning fire in measured bursts, making ammunition last. The creak of floorboards as people moved, preparing, waiting. They had completed 8 columns when Eleanor heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. Tommy's voice raised in alarm, followed by boots hammering across the cabin floor. Mrs. Blackwell, they're inside. Eleanor dropped her tools and scrambled up the ladder with Garrett close behind. She emerged into chaos. The front door hung splintered on its hinges. Cross stood in the cabin's center, his rifle trained on Marcus, while 2 of his men held Chen at gunpoint near the eastern wall. And Tommy. Cross's left hand gripped the boy's collar, holding him like a shield, while his right hand kept the rifle steady. Everyone stops moving, Cross commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Drop your weapons, slowly. Marcus and Chen had no choice. Their guns clattered to the floor. Eleanor stood frozen at the top of the ladder, her own revolver tucked in her belt, but useless with Tommy in Cross's grip. Smart woman, Cross observed, his eyes finding hers. You understand tactical reality. The boy stays healthy as long as everyone cooperates. The moment someone tries heroics, he pays the price. Let him go, Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. He's a child. He has nothing to do with this. He has everything to do with this. He's leverage, insurance. The thing that keeps you all from doing something stupid while my men finish securing the perimeter. Cross gestured with his rifle toward the open door. Senator Wade is on his way, wants to handle this situation personally, make sure there are no loose ends. Eleanor's mind raced. Wade coming here meant this was about more than suppressing evidence. The senator wanted complete control, wanted to ensure every witness was silenced permanently. Tommy struggled against Cross's grip, his young face flushed with anger and fear. As he twisted, something fell from his pocket. The wooden soldier clattered across the floor, rolling to rest against Eleanor's boot. But something else had fallen too, something small and metallic that gleamed in the lamplight. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized it, the detonator trigger. The mechanical fuse she had been preparing to use for the final collapse sequence. Tommy must have taken it when she was distracted, thinking perhaps to help to contribute somehow to the defense. And now it lay on the floor between them, visible to everyone. Cross's eyes followed her gaze. His expression shifted as he recognized the device for what it was. "What is that?" "Nothing," Eleanor said too quickly. "That's an engineering trigger. Military demolition hardware." Cross's tactical mind was already calculating possibilities. "You've rigged this place, planned to bring it down on us." "It's too late for that now," Eleanor lied. "The sequence requires hours of preparation. We barely started." But Cross was studying the room with new eyes, noting the trapdoor to the root cellar, the subtle ways the cabin's interior had been modified. His grip on Tommy tightened. "How many charges?" "What's the blast radius?" "There are no charges," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice calm. "My husband designed a structural collapse. If triggered, the support columns beneath this cabin give way in sequence. The building drops into a protected cavity, while the surrounding hillside falls inward." Cross processed this, his professional assessment visible in the way his gaze swept the cabin's corners and ceiling. "Clever, very clever. Your husband was quite the engineer." He looked back at Eleanor. "But you said it takes hours to prepare, which means the system isn't ready, which means you're still vulnerable." Before Eleanor could respond, movement outside drew everyone's attention. Horses approaching at speed, many of them, their hoofbeats thundering across frozen ground. Through the shattered door, Eleanor watched a procession emerge from the darkness. 15 riders, maybe more, surrounding a central figure whose bearing proclaimed authority even at a distance. They reined in before the cabin, and the central rider dismounted with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being watched and deferred to. Senator Harrison Wade stepped into the lamplight like a man taking a stage. He was perhaps 58, silver-haired and distinguished, wearing a long coat that spoke of Eastern tailoring and significant wealth. His face held the practiced warmth of a politician, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and privilege. "What a pleasure to finally meet you, though I confess I rather hoped you had died in that fire 3 years ago. Would have saved everyone considerable trouble." Eleanor said nothing. Her attention split between Wade's armed escort spreading out to secure the area and Tommy still held tight in Cross's grip. Wade surveyed the cabin's interior with evident distaste. "Quite the fortress your late husband built. Captain Blackwell always did have a talent for defensive positions. Pity he never learned when to simply follow orders and avoid complications." He turned his attention to Marcus. "Sergeant Stone. Still playing at justice and righteousness, I see. Some men never learn that the world runs on power, not principles." "Some of us remember our oaths," Marcus replied evenly, "to protect and serve, not to murder civilians for mineral rights." Copper Creek. Wade's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. That unfortunate incident was handled according to military necessity. Hostile forces threatening American interests required decisive response. "They were families," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through Wade's political deflection. "Women, children, old men, 47 people who never threatened anyone. You ordered their execution to clear land for mining claims. I ordered military action based on intelligence provided by field commanders." Wade's tone remained pleasant, reasonable. "If that intelligence proved flawed, the responsibility lies with those who provided it. Captain Blackwell, for instance." "James refused to lie for you," Eleanor said. "He documented everything, every order you gave, every directive to eliminate witnesses. Samuel Grant saw it all, testified to it all, and you've spent 3 years trying to bury that truth." Wade smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Bury is such an appropriate word given present circumstances. Yes, Mrs. Blackwell, I've worked very hard to ensure certain historical inaccuracies remain corrected." Captain Blackwell's misguided attempts at confession, Samuel Grant's unfortunate crusade for what he called justice. All of it needed proper management. He gestured to Cross and the armed men surrounding the cabin. "Which brings us to tonight's unpleasantness. I had hoped Mr. Cross could resolve this quietly. A simple property transfer, perhaps a regrettable accident. But you've proven remarkably difficult to eliminate, so I've come personally to ensure the job gets done properly." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. Wade was admitting everything, confessing to conspiracy and murder without hesitation or shame, which meant he had no intention of leaving witnesses. Marcus clearly reached the same conclusion. "You're planning to kill all of us, even Cross and his men. Can't leave anyone who knows the truth." Wade's smile widened slightly. "Sergeant Stone, you always were perceptive. Yes, I'm afraid Mr. Cross and his associates will also meet unfortunate ends tonight. Tragic, really. A gunfight between claim jumpers and the heroic men who tried to stop them. Everyone dead. No survivors to contradict the official report I'll file." Cross's face went rigid. The rifle in his hands shifted slightly, no longer quite so steadily pointed at Marcus. "You're planning to kill me." Cross's voice carried genuine surprise. "After everything I've done for you, every job I've handled quietly and professionally, you know too much, Nathaniel. Surely you understood this was always a possibility. Loose ends create problems. I've built my career on eliminating problems before they become crises." The tension in the cabin crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. Cross stood at the center of it, his professional loyalty crumbling as he realized Wade's betrayal. His grip on Tommy loosened slightly as his mind recalculated every assumption about his employer. Marcus saw the opening and moved with veteran speed. His hand dropped toward the revolver at his belt, drawing in one smooth motion. But Wade's men were faster. 2 rifles cracked simultaneously. Marcus stumbled backward, red blooming across his shoulder and side. He collapsed against the wall, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Chen dove for cover, reaching for his own weapon, but more shots drove him back. The cabin erupted into chaos as everyone sought protection from the sudden storm of gunfire. Eleanor threw herself toward Tommy, desperate to shield the boy from the violence. But Cross still held him, pulling him toward the door, even as his own men realized Wade's betrayal and began turning their weapons in confusion. "Enough!" The shout cut through the chaos. Marcus, bleeding but conscious, had somehow retrieved his revolver and now held it pressed against his own temple. "Everyone stop shooting, or I blow my own brains out right here." The bizarre threat worked through pure unexpectedness. Wade's men hesitated, unsure how to respond to a hostage who threatened himself. In that moment of frozen confusion, Marcus continued, "Mrs. Blackwell, tell them about the evidence. Tell them what we sent to Santa Fe." Eleanor understood instantly. Marcus was creating a scenario, buying time, forcing Wade to doubt his position of absolute control. "Private Davis left 2 days ago," she called out, her voice carrying authority despite her fear. "He's carrying complete documentation of Copper Creek, Captain Blackwell's war diary, photographs, correspondence between you and James, everything needed to prove you ordered the massacre." Wade's expression flickered calculation, replacing certainty. "You're bluffing. If you had such evidence, you would have used it years ago." "We found it," Marcus said, his voice strained with pain but steady. "In the root cellar. James Blackwell was smarter than you gave him credit for. He documented everything, and we copied it all." From his pocket, Marcus withdrew something small and black. A camera compact, and clearly designed for covert documentation. "Photographed every page," he continued. "Every order, every signature, every piece of evidence that proves your guilt. And before Cross breached our defenses, we sent those photographs to the territorial governor in Santa Fe." Wade's face went pale. Not with fear, Eleanor realized, but with rage. The kind of cold fury that came from a plan unraveling despite meticulous preparation. "When?" he demanded. "When did this alleged courier leave?" 3 days ago," Eleanor lied smoothly. understanding now what Marcus was creating. Private Chen rode out the back route while Cross was busy with his first assault. He's already reached Santa Fe by now, already delivered the evidence, already set in motion an investigation you can't stop. It was a masterful bluff. Chen stood right there in the cabin, visible proof the story was false. But Wade didn't know that. Couldn't know that in the chaos and darkness and confusion. Cross, still processing Wade's betrayal, looked between Marcus and the senator with dawning understanding. "You're telling me there's no point to any of this?" he asked Wade. "The evidence is already out there. Everything I've done for you was pointless." "He's lying," Wade snapped. "An obvious deception to buy time." "Maybe." Cross's rifle swung away from Marcus, now pointed at Wade. "But you just admitted you were planning to kill me anyway, so maybe I don't much care if he's lying or not. Maybe I care more about not being your cleanup problem." The shift in allegiance was palpable. Cross's men professionals, who had signed on for money and simple work, found themselves caught between a senator who planned to murder them and a widow who offered at least the possibility of survival. Wade sensed the change and adjusted tactics with politician's instinct. "Mr. Cross, there's been a misunderstanding. I never intended—" The gunshot cut through his words. Not from Cross, though his finger had been tightening on the trigger. The shot came from outside from one of Wade's men who had moved to flank Cross's position. Cross staggered, a red stain spreading across his chest, but even wounded, his rifle tracked toward Wade with professional precision. His finger tightened on the trigger. The bullet took Wade high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the cabin floor. His cry of pain triggered immediate response from his guards, who opened fire on Cross and his men without hesitation. The cabin became a killing ground. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass. Men shouted and cursed and died in the confined space. Eleanor threw herself over Tommy, shielding him with her body as the world dissolved into violence and chaos. Through the madness, she saw Garrett moving toward the trapdoor, saw him disappear below, understanding what needed to be done. The collapse had to be triggered now, while everyone was distracted, while the chaos provided cover. She needed to help him, needed to complete the sequence James had designed, but Tommy was beneath her, and she could not leave him exposed to the gunfire. Marcus, bleeding from multiple wounds, now had dragged himself to Chen's position. Together, they returned fire at Wade's men, creating enough suppression to keep the senator's guards pinned. But there were too many. 15 armed men against 2 wounded soldiers and a handful of mercenaries who had realized too late that they were on the wrong side. Eleanor made her decision in a heartbeat. She pulled Tommy to his feet and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the reinforced interior room James had built. "Stay here," she commanded, pushing him through the door. "No matter what. You promised me." "Mrs. Blackwell, no. You can't—" She slammed the door and drove the bolt home, sealing him inside the only truly safe space in the cabin. Then she ran for the trapdoor and descended into the chamber where Garrett was already working frantically on the support columns. "How many left?" she shouted over the gunfire echoing from above. 7. We need to finish them fast or the sequence won't complete before someone gets down here." They worked with desperate speed. Garrett's saw screamed through timber while Eleanor braced and positioned according to James's diagrams. Above them, the battle raged. She could hear Wade's voice commanding his men despite his wound, could hear Cross's labored breathing as he returned fire, could hear the crack of rifles and the splintering of wood. Column 18 fell. 19, 20. A figure appeared at the trapdoor, one of Wade's men recognizing the threat below and moving to stop it. Garrett dropped his saw and drew his revolver, firing 3 rapid shots that sent the man tumbling backward. But more would come. They were out of time. "The trigger column," Eleanor said urgently. "We do it now, incomplete sequence or not. It won't settle properly. The cabin might crush instead of protecting. Then we'll have died trying. Help me move it." Together they attacked column 23, the massive central support that James had designed as the final trigger. The brackets released under hammer blows, metal screaming against metal as precision mechanisms gave way. The column shifted, moved, toppled. For one eternal moment, nothing happened. Then the world ended. The first support gave way with a sound like artillery fire, then the second, the third. A cascading failure as James's carefully engineered sequence activated despite being incomplete, despite missing 3 columns from the planned preparation. The cabin floor above buckled and dropped. Eleanor heard screams cut short as men fell into sudden voids, heard Wade shouting orders that dissolved into curses of fear, heard the mountain itself groan as tons of earth began their inward collapse. "Run!" Garrett grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the reinforced alcove James had built at the chamber's far end. They sprinted across shifting ground as the world came apart behind them. Stone and timber and earth cascaded inward, the hillside collapsing exactly as James had calculated, burying siege positions and attacking forces beneath geological weight nothing human could resist. Eleanor dove into the alcove as debris struck like hail, felt Garrett's body covering hers protectively, felt the impact of falling stone against the alcove's reinforced entrance. The noise transcended description, became a physical force that threatened to shatter thought itself. Then silence, absolute and ringing and somehow more terrible than the chaos that preceded it. Eleanor lifted her head cautiously. Dust choked the air, making each breath a labor. Darkness pressed close, broken only by thin shafts of light filtering through the wreckage above. "Garrett," she called. "Here. Can't feel my legs, though." She worked her way to him in the darkness, her hands finding timber pinning his lower body. Together they levered it free, and Garrett dragged himself clear with a gasp of pain. "Broken! Don't think so, but I won't be dancing anytime soon." They sat in the darkness and breathed. Alive. Against all probability, impossibly alive. But what of the others? What of Tommy in his reinforced room, Marcus and Chen in the cabin above? Had James's incomplete sequence crushed them, or had the protective pocket held despite the rushed implementation? "We have to dig out," Eleanor said. They began moving debris. 2 wounded people carved a path upward through transformed geology. It took hours. Twice they nearly gave up, exhausted beyond endurance. But the thought of Tommy trapped somewhere above kept Eleanor moving. Finally, light. Real, light sunlight streaming through a gap in the wreckage. Eleanor squeezed through and emerged onto a landscape that no longer resembled anything she knew. Where her cabin had stood, there now existed a massive depression, as if the earth had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. The structure had dropped perhaps 20 feet, settling into the cavity James had prepared. Its roof sat level with the surrounding ground walls, intact but half buried. The siege positions where Wade's men had been stationed simply no longer existed, buried beneath tons of displaced earth. Eleanor could see where the collapse had extended, taking down trees and reshaping terrain for 100 yards in every direction. James had not built a defense. He had weaponized the mountain itself. Movement caught her eye. A section of the cabin's roof shifting, then lifting. A figure emerged, covered in dust but moving, Marcus pulling himself through a gap in the wreckage, then Chen helping someone else. A small figure. Tommy. Eleanor felt her legs give way. She sat heavily on displaced stone and watched her unlikely family pull themselves from ruins that should have killed them all. The reinforced interior room had held. James's engineering had saved the boy she had sworn to protect. The son of the man she had killed lived because her husband had built protection for exactly this scenario. Marcus limped toward her, bleeding from multiple wounds, but somehow still moving. "Wade?" she asked. "Dead?" Crushed when the floor gave way. "Most of his men, too." Marcus's voice carried no triumph, only exhaustion. "Cross made it part way out, found him at the edge of the collapse. He was still alive when I reached him. He lasted long enough to say something. Said to tell you he was sorry, that he knew you were just trying to protect your husband, that he understood what it meant to make impossible choices." Marcus paused. Then he died, quietly, like a soldier. Eleanor absorbed this, adding Cross's name to the weight she carried. He had been an enemy, but also a man who recognized his own betrayal and tried at the end to choose better. Tommy reached them covered in dust and wide-eyed with shock, but miraculously unharmed. He looked at the transformed landscape, at the buried remains of Wade's assault force, at the price paid in lives for this desperate defense. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice small. "The fighting is," Eleanor said, "but the rest is just beginning." She was right. Within hours, riders appeared on the ridge. Not Wade's men this time, but territorial marshals wearing official badges, led by a weathered man who introduced himself as Marshal Rodriguez. "Mrs. Blackwell, we received urgent communication from Private Davis 3 days ago. He reached Santa Fe with evidence regarding Senator Wade's activities. The governor sent us immediately." "You're too late," Eleanor said tiredly. "Wade is dead, buried under that." She gestured at the transformed hillside. Rodriguez surveyed the devastation with professional assessment. "That's going to complicate the legal proceedings considerably, but we still need your testimony. All of you. About Copper Creek. About what happened here." Eleanor stood drawing herself up despite exhaustion. "You'll have it. Complete and honest testimony about everything, including my murder of Samuel Grant 3 years ago." The marshal's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, you don't have to confess to anything. You have rights. I'm waiving them. I want the truth on record, all of it. Samuel Grant came here to help my husband do the right thing. I killed him out of fear and ignorance. That's murder, Marshal, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Mrs. Blackwell. We'll take your statement, all of your statements. This is going to be the most complicated case the territory has seen in years." As they prepared to leave Deadfall Ridge, Eleanor took one last look at the place that had been her prison and refuge. The cabin lay half buried, the landscape forever changed. James's final defense had worked exactly as designed, saving them all at terrible cost. Tommy walked beside her toward the waiting horses. He did not take her hand, did not offer comfort through touch. But his presence, his willingness to walk alongside the woman who had killed his father, spoke of something more valuable than forgiveness, understanding perhaps, or simply the recognition that people could be both guilty and honestly trying to make amends. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said as they reached the horses, "after the trial, after everything, what will you do? That depends on what the judge decides. But whatever happens, I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to honor your father's memory, trying to be worthy of the sacrifice he made." He'd want the truth told, about Copper Creek, about what Senator Wade did, about why 47 people died. "Then that's what we'll do. Together, you and I. We'll make sure those people are remembered. Make sure their deaths weren't meaningless." Tommy nodded slowly. Then with visible effort, he reached out and took her hand. Not forgiveness, but acceptance, connection, the beginning of something that might eventually approach healing. They rode down from Deadfall Ridge as the sun climbed higher, burning away the dust and chaos of the night. Behind them, the mountain kept its secrets, burying Wade and his men beneath geological weight, transforming evidence into earth and stone. But the truth lived on. In Eleanor's testimony, in Tommy's witness, in the evidence Davis had delivered to Santa Fe, in Marcus and Chen's accounts of everything that had transpired. Copper Creek would finally have its reckoning. The 47 would be remembered. And Samuel Grant's death, tragic and senseless, would at least serve the cause he had died pursuing. Eleanor knew what awaited her: trial, judgment, possibly execution. The law would not look kindly on her killing of an innocent man regardless of circumstances or intent, but she would face it honestly, would tell the truth without excuse or mitigation, would accept whatever consequence the law demanded, because that was what Samuel Grant deserved, what James had tried to give through his suicide and his final defenses, what Tommy needed to believe in, that people could face their mistakes and accept responsibility even when acceptance meant destruction. As they rode toward Santa Fe, and whatever waited there, Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in 3 years. Not peace which remained beyond her reach, not forgiveness which she neither expected nor deserved, but honesty, pure and terrible, and somehow liberating. The truth was finally free. The silence was finally broken. And Eleanor Blackwell, murderer and witness and reluctant hero, was finally ready to face what came next. Tommy rode beside her, and occasionally their eyes met. In those glances Eleanor saw her future, not redemption, which might never come, but purpose. The chance to make Samuel Grant's death mean something beyond tragedy. The mountain fell away behind them. Ahead lay justice both for Eleanor's crime and for the massacre at Copper Creek. The path would be hard, but it would be walked in truth. And in the end, Truth was all they had, all any of them had ever had, the only thing worth dying for, the only thing worth living for. The silence of Deadfall Ridge was broken, the truth was free, and 47 souls who had died in darkness might finally at last rest in light.